Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this Saturday afternoon for what I'm sure is going to be a super generous conversation between Carolyn Lazard and Meg Onli on the occasion of Long Take. My name is Rachel Morillo, and I'm the DAJ Director of Public Engagement and Research here at the ICA. And I'm so excited that we have finally opened this stellar exhibition last night to a lot of fanfare, and that you all are here to learn a bit more about it. The Long Take, the immersive multimedia installation, which opened on our second floor galleries last night, is the most recent collaboration between Carolyn and Meg as artist and curator, respectively. It was co-commissioned with the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis and the Nottingham Contemporary in the UK. And personally, I feel it is especially meaningful for us here at ICA to be able to showcase this particular project, given both Carolyn and Meg's extensive contributions to not only the field at large, but to our own history specifically. Carolyn is an alum of Penn's MFA program, and Meg is the former Andrea B. Laporte Associate Curator here at ICA. I have to say that for me, Meg's work here, including the groundbreaking exhibition Colored People Time, was what brought me to ICA as a visitor in undergrad. So I'm a big fan, and I'm sure you all are too. My words are probably going to fail me a bit in capturing Long Take, but in its essence, it is the presentation of a dance film without an image. Carolyn takes the history of dance for camera as a jumping off point in exploring how movements towards democratizing and making dance more accessible have shaped the art form itself. Through the representation of dance, dance documentation and its reception, they also invite us to think through and question, as they said yesterday, what the preconditions of experiencing an artwork are, whether it be the possibility of seeing, hearing, or moving in certain ways. At the heart of Dance for Camera are networks of creative collaboration amongst artists across forms, something that's also super central to Carolyn's own practice, and this exhibition specifically. For example, Leans Reverses, the sound and video installation that anchors Long Take, was made in collaboration with poet and artist Joselia Rebecca Hughes and dancer and choreographer Jerron Herman, who I think might be among us today, right here. I'm gonna keep my remarks short, but I just wanted to say, for me, this is really such a juicy artwork. It represents art that asks us to stay longer, to feel deeper, and engage with our bodies as tools of knowing. And so if you haven't had a chance to visit the gallery upstairs, I really do recommend doing so after the talk. For those of you joining us virtually, a visual description of the installation will also be available, courtesy of the wonderful folks at Philly Touch Tours sometime soon. And please do keep an eye on our website for more programming. You might have seen some slides earlier, but we'll have performances or performative response to the exhibition by Jerron and Jerome Ellis later in the spring and summer. So yeah, sign up for the newsletter, look at the website, and without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Meg, who will get us started. As I think you really don't need an introduction, but Meg Onli is a curator and writer who has held appointments at the ICA Philadelphia and the Underground Museum. She is also the co-organizer for the upcoming 2024 Whitney Biennial alongside Chrissy Isles. She is the recipient of numerous awards and grants, including the 2012 Creative Capital Andy Warhol Foundation Arts Writer Grant for her project Black Visual Archive. Yeah, I'm like, what else can I say? You are the blueprint in so many ways for a lot of us arts administrators in terms of how to deeply and continuously engage with an artist's practice. And so I'm so excited to hear what you all have to say, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rachel. That's so sweet. Before I say anything else, I know there are some people trying to find seats. If anyone has an open seat near them, can you just raise your hand? And if you feel comfortable, can people move down so that people can access seats easily just on the outside? Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And if you're not comfortable, I always want the aisle seat out of anxiety, so I understand if you want to keep it, but I would love to get as many people in here as possible. Rachel, thank you so much. I also want to thank Hallie. You've been amazing to work with. I see Christina in the back, Derek, Elizabeth. I don't think Brittany's here, but maybe Brittany, who's fantastic on public engagement side. I also want to give a huge shout out to Zoe Ryan, director here at ICA, who has worked with me and has brought along this project. It is amazing to be back, and I always have to say a shout out to Mary Holmes, my OG co-conspirator here at ICA, and a shout out to Terrence Nance as well, whose show just opened, and maybe lastly, Constance, our fantastic photographer, who always captures me in the greatest of light. Today, it feels so special. I feel, oh God, we've cried a couple times together already. I'm not going to try and make you cry, but I just have to say that, you know, Carolyn and I have known each other now for 6 years, and we met first here at the ICA, and you have become just a incredibly important interlocutor of mine. You challenge me. You're one of my best friends. I love you, and I love to argue with you. I always say you're my favorite person to argue with. And the past 2 weeks have just been an amazing collaboration to be in this space together and think in time and space. And so I just want to say, first, I'm just so deeply appreciative of you. If I see some faces who were at the opening last night, so you all understand that we're probably hungover because it was an amazing party. This is going to be very casual.
Give us some grace.
Give us grace. Don't worry, Zoe, I won't get hot on the mic, as I often do. But I just want to say that this is going to be very, very conversational. I have some questions for Caro, but I also want to open it up to people at the same time. We'll probably talk for about close to an hour. We'll open it for Q&A, but if there's things that also maybe you feel like I've said and you don't understand, or you want us to maybe provide a little more context, please feel free to shout out and just let us know. I'm going to read really quickly a quick bio of you, and then I'll turn it over to you for thanks before we get into some questions. So Carolyn Lazard works across mediums to consider the aesthetic and material dimensions of dependency, care, and access. Lazard's work considers care as a collective rather than individual concern, shifting our assumptions of accessibility of how we come together. On view in the second floor gallery is the exhibition Long Take, which attends to the legacy of dance for camera, a form of choreography for film that emerged in the 1960s. That'll be the primary work that we're talking about, even though there's a couple more works to that. And before I turn it over to you for thank yous, I also just forgot to say a huge thank you to Donna and Nancy, who are providing ASL interpretation today. So thank you both so much for showing up.
Cool, thank you. My thank yous. I don't want to say, I'm going to cry, so I'm just going to say ditto, I love you. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you for supporting this project and allowing it to happen and championing it. Thank you, Hallie, Richard, Robert, Kate, Rachel, Derek, everybody here, all of the incredible art handlers who, you know, Emily and Scott. Yeah, it's just wonderful to be here. This is my hometown, so it's really special to be back here and to get to do an exhibition here. I used to come see shows here as a teenager, so it's really amazing to get to show my work here. I also want to just give a really special thank you to Jerron, who's here, who is the person you hear dancing upstairs. This work is inspired by like all the incredible dancers in my life who've taught me so much, and it just means so much for you to be here, so thank you for coming. And yeah, I think I'll stop there.
And maybe one thing just to say
Yeah,
is that there's tons of people we really love in the audience.
I know.
There's so many people that we've known for years. My mom is here, so my mom shows up to everything. Thank you, Mom. But there's so many people that we absolutely love and have engaged with your work. Amber Rose Johnson, you've lifted heavy for both Carolyn and I. Cameron, Zakia, people are out here, and I just really appreciate all of you coming out and loving us.
My friends from high school are here.
Friends from high school, look at this. So, without further ado, let's get into it. So, within this piece, and I hope, most of you have had a chance to at least see the work. If not, I hope you have a chance to go upstairs and check it out. But this exhibition is anchored by Lean's Reverses, which is a very beautiful, immersive installation performed by Duran, as well interpreted by Giselia Rebecca Hughes. And I thought maybe one thing we could start with is a description of that piece, because so much of that work relies on description.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll just describe Lean's Reverses, or maybe the best way to describe it is to talk about the process of making it and working with my collaborators. So, yeah, I think Rachel sort of said this, but I started this work thinking about what it would mean or what it would feel like to make a dance film or a dance video without an image. And in that, I wanted to work with two artists who I know well, Duran, who's here, and Giselia Rebecca Hughes, who's a poet. And I started by generating a dance score, which I generated just by looking at a lot of different examples of dance prompts and dance interpretation. The New York Public Library has an incredible archive of dance. It's a great place to go if you just want to look up really anything. So in there you'll find improvisation prompts from Steve Paxton and Yvonne Rainer and things that you're how are these pedagogical notes just in here. But I was looking at these things. I wanted to generate a score that was as broad as possible, to generate as expansive a possibility of movement as possible, and I wanted to give my performer a lot of leeway. So I wrote this score. I recorded it over a specific duration. It's kind of interesting. It's the dance the duration of the dance is preset by the duration of the score. So I read these dance prompts and recorded them, and then I gave them to Duran. Duran listened to them on headphones and listened to this recording and then improvised in response to the score. And while Duran was performing, we covered his body in microphones, wireless mics, which picked up the sound of his movement. Simultaneously, we recorded a video of Duran performing. I knew that no one would ever see this video, but the video was essentially a reference for writing the audio description of Duran's movement. So then Giselia and I worked together to collaboratively write this description, which was really fun. Audio description is something that we generally see as being kind of boring, but when you write it together, it can be really exciting because everybody brings their own references to the writing of the description, which shapes it and kind of I would say de-institutionalizes it in a certain way.
The Mary J. Blige two-step reference.
Exactly, yeah.
We all know what that looks like.
Exactly. So it's there are just certain things in there that feel really particular and not less of a protocol and more of a cultural sensibility that I think you can bring to audio description, that it doesn't have to be institutional. It can be intimate and collective and convivial. So yeah, we wrote that, and then that became the AD of the work. And so that's essentially what the work is one track of this dance score, one track of the sound of the performance, and then one track of the reading of the audio description. So you hear it and you also read it. So there isn't anything in the work that you see and don't hear, and there's nothing in the work that you hear and don't see.
I've been spending the past couple of weeks with the work as we were installing it, and yesterday, you kind of have this chance to once over any last thing that you want to tweak, and I was sitting in there with my partner, and I heard someone come in, or what I presumed to be someone coming in. And I turned around and no one was there. It was simply Jerron performing that surrounded me within that space. And it was startling and really beautiful. And having known the piece, you know, you and I have been talking about this work for quite some time. It's very different to experience it and to be surrounded by a person performing. And yesterday we were having a press walkthrough. And I started talking with some of the press, and someone said to me, you know, that the dancer is not present. And I was so blown away by that, for the dancer not to be present, because the dancer is everywhere within this work. And so I'm wondering, you know, what do you think of that response? But also, what are the ways in which we are so accustomed to focusing and having our primary experience of dance to be in the consumption through sight?
Yeah, this makes me want to like bring up the Carrie Beatty book, Being Watched.
Being Watched,
yeah.
That's a good book.
You know, which is basically that like our understanding of dance is primarily visual, and that like we relate to dance as a medium as something that is like seen, that's based on like gazing upon the body and sort of like consuming and perceiving the body through the eyes. And there are people who've kind of like addressed this. I mean, I guess Yvonne's going to come up a lot, but there's like, you know, dancers and choreographers who've like addressed this in their work. Like there's, you know, in Yvonne Rayner's performance Trio A, like she tries to deal with this by, like whenever people perform that dance, they're not allowed to look at the audience, so they have to like avert their gaze in this certain way, and it's supposed to be like kind of an attempt to like subvert this thing around you know, the body being consumed through dance. So yeah, I think this for me was just like, you know, I don't come to this as a dancer. I come to this as like a fanboy, basically, of like my friends, and also as somebody who's like interested in video and interested in like experimental video traditions like dance for camera. And, you know, I just thought, why is this our primary experience or way of experiencing other people's embodiment? Like there has to be another way for this. And I think that's when, you know, the ideas were kind of generated for the work, and trying to think through dance sonically rather than visually. I guess I don't agree with that statement. I think
I don't either.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jerron's body. So we're going to talk about you so much. Jerron's body is like, you know, is kind of everywhere. Like the kind of affect of your presence and your movement is just kind of all over the place. But maybe one thing that's interesting to say here is just that I also was just thinking a lot about video installation and like immersive video installation, which is something that I love, and also something that I think requires the viewer to kind of project out of their bodies in a certain way. And that you're kind of like, you know, an image is projected, but you're also projected in a way. Whereas I think in this work, because it's kind of, you know, you walk into a huge dark room, you're walking into an amphitheater, and so there's like all of these, it's sort of coded as spectacular video installation, but when you come in, you're actually just like left with just like the presence of your own body, basically, where it's kind of like, it's like you can't necessarily project in that space.
Yeah.
And that's something that I'm kind of interested in the work, is like kind of working with and against and playing with the expectations of like immersion in art.
Well, it's interesting because during the install, you know, a lot of the key to this show is the lighting, which was really fantastically designed by Emily and Scott in collaboration with you and I. And it was definitely the longest lighting I've ever done on a show. It's definitely the weirdest lighting I've done on a show, to not light any of the objects and to try and light the space. But it's interesting because any moment that we had not instructed Emily to not cast shadows, but that ended up being what happened within the space. And when suddenly a shadow was cast by one of our bodies, it felt very disruptive suddenly. And so it's this interest of you mentioning the way in which you suddenly feel your body within this space. But I think there's also a moment where it feels as if you leave your body when you're listening to the movements, you're listening to, you know, yourself. And and Giselia, speaking over as well. I wonder, just maybe following up on the last question I had, is maybe thinking about presentness, and how do you know who you're in the presence of without sight? And I think it was something you and I were talking about of what did it mean to not, I think I was coming at this from very much an art world perspective, and I think maybe sometimes that's why when you and I've talked about the work, I've thought a lot about conversations around figuration, the dissemination around Black bodies, Black disabled bodies, and that was kind of the lens that I initially read this within, and that is not how you were necessarily approaching it.
Can you remind me how I was approaching it?
Absolutely. I think for me, I was thinking about opacity as a tool and strategy to break up the easy consumption of, let's say, Duran, it is very weird for you to be here if you see Duran's body, I'm sorry. But, you said, well, also, how do we know who we're in the presence of with other senses?
Okay, yeah, I mean, I think that's a good maybe entry point into thinking about what access is and what access is for, and how we traditionally conceive of access, and how, I think we traditionally conceive of access as a thing that has to do with transparency, having to make things clear or to elucidate things in other idioms or modalities as a kind of act of translation, clarification. And I think for me, I'm not interested in that. And I would say that maybe that might be the way that institutions relate to access. But I think a lot, and it's not just me, I would say a lot of disabled folks, a lot of people in disability arts community are thinking about this deeply, which is what is access? How can we recuperate it from institutional appropriation? I think one of the ways is to actually think about access in a kind of collective way, as a way we come together, and then also as a tool of fugitivity inside of institutions, so that access becomes the work upstairs is a work that I think is perceivable by a wider audience than I think what is traditionally framed inside of museums. But I don't know if that means the work is any clearer, if that makes sense. I think I'm interested in thinking about access that might, something I've said in the past is that I think all museum goers, all spectators, all audiences are entitled to the incoherence of art, and that art should be incoherent for everybody, including disabled people. So the processes of access, the processes of translation, they don't need to be clear. They can be muddied, they can be complex, they can be opaque, actually, and to hold space for varied people's interpretations and experiences with a quote-unquote singular artwork, which I also think this work kind of challenges too, which is something I'm thinking about is just the boundedness of an artwork, and how this work isn't actually bounded. It's a score that becomes a performance, that becomes a description, that then also functions potentially as an instruction. Because when people come into this space, or this is my third time installing it, so I've gotten to see that when people come into this space, they start to interpret the description as instruction. And so the work then kind of carries on, in a way, in the bodies of the spectators. And yeah, so I think this also maybe has something to do with your question about presence, or maybe I would say liveness, which is, I think, something that obviously people in performance are thinking about. But I think about it in the context of the ongoing pandemic and the kinds of isolation that people are experiencing, and how we might think through artistic medium in ways that accommodate or respond to those conditions. So how can a dance become a sound, and then it can become a text that can be on the internet that might circulate in a wide variety of ways, and to not think about an artwork's, how do I say this, an artwork's ontology in such a bounded way, but to actually allow it to kind of devolve and expand and operate in a lot of different ways. in and outside of the institution.
You said so many things that I wanted to respond to. I was like, there's so much. Maybe the first thing I'm gonna maybe chew on for a minute is a word you didn't use, but like legibility. And it's making me think about, at brunch this morning, we were all talking about like, what did it mean for a group of Black producers, cultural producers, to make our work legible to not just white audiences, but like audiences that might not have the same type of expertise, knowledge, language as, you know, the artists you're working with. And I have to say, you know, you're an artist that I'm so thankful how much I feel you trust me, and I trust you. And I think there's a place where we can make things together that sometimes I don't understand. And I'm like, okay with that, because there's going to be a moment in which I do understand, because I fully trust you and I understand this is the limitation of like my set of tools in that moment, which is a humbling experience and challenging at times. But I think it's, do you want to say something?
I was just going to say, like, but I also make things I don't understand.
Well, that's
you know, like,
that's true.
And that's kind of like the hope in some ways, is that you can make a thing whose like interpretation is so expansive that it extends beyond your own capacity to understand what it's doing. And I think that's the interesting thing about access, is like, not everybody has to receive it in the same way. That's not, you know, that's kind of not the point, you know?
For sure.
And that, yeah, that's the hope, yeah.
But I'm thinking about, you know, in that lack of legibility, and that's maybe not the fullest term that I want to be using right now. It's interesting when it meets the institution. And I think there's a place for me where I'm deeply interested in the friction that institutions provide. Like, I'm not very interested in changing institutions. I'm really interested in what I often say is the mess of the institution. Like, museums have been a mess forever. I will not clean it up. Like, I am not the one to clean it up. I really am interested in like what those things are that we can pick apart and work with and examine. But I think you're a person, and I'm saying lots of things at the same time here, but it's hard for me to underscore the importance of your practice within contemporary art institutions today. Your writing, your works have been, you know, really circulated quite widely. And a lot of them have been used to implement accessibility practices. And so maybe one of the things I'm thinking about is just what happens when the work that you have made, the model maybe people have taken from you, hit each other, and there is this like lack of seeing each other, or there's a way in which you want to run the work in a way that seems legible, but like sometimes illegibility is enough. Is that enough? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that gets back to like the question of fugitivity and how access can like do that, basically, which is that like the whole point is so that we can become maybe legible to each other, but not necessarily legible to the institution. And I'm like, I'm like hesitating to say this because I've probably said this in so many artist talks, but it's like the one like Motonism that I'll like bring into the conversation, which is just the idea of being like in and not of institutions. And that's something that I really carry with me as I make my work, which is like, how can I occupy this space without like being a part of it in some way, or how can I find ways to relate, and not necessarily antagonistically. I'm too exhausted to do that, you know, but really just understanding that like being in is not necessarily being like subsumed by, and that there are ways to kind of signal to each other even within these spaces, right? That like the work upstairs is largely for, I mean, it's for everybody, but it's sort of sending a signal to some specific folks also. Yeah. And I think that's what I'm trying to do, if that makes sense.
I'm trying to decide if I want to go back or if I want to move forward here. I'm going to say maybe something.
Yeah.
One of the works, so there's 3 works within the exhibition, and one of them is a institutional bench intervention. And, you know, when you and I first met, I installed my first show here, Speech Acts, and the first thing you said to me in the very first gallery is, why wasn't there seating for Martine Sims's lessons? And these are 30-second commercials for the Black Radical Imagination. And I was like, in my head, I'm like, the seating's ugly. Like, I just wanted this. It looks so good. You should like Google it. It looked like really fantastic for Martine. And you were like, who are you to decide like how long someone should spend with a video? And it's something that, I immediately changed. Seating has become an absolute priority for video. And even when I see videos that do not have seating anymore, and I talk to younger curators, both Chrissy and I are on BARD's graduate committee, and we always say, it's a signal that we're not expecting you to watch the thing. And so in that, I designed a bench that the ICA has been using for some time. And it's kind of amazing because you've come back and critiqued the bench I made. The bench I tried so hard to design to satisfy you. And it wasn't enough. And I'm wondering, could you talk about those interventions? I love that also just the
We made it together.
We did make it together.
I guess I'll say, this work is a co-commission with the Walker Art Center and Nottingham Contemporary. So there've been 12 benches made for each institution, and they're called institutional seat, and they're numbered. And all they are, if you haven't been upstairs, is they're sort of like, I'm going to pantomime this and describe it at the same time. I'm making a shape with my hand that is like going up and then across and over, like the shape of like a pretty rudimentary bench. So all it is a kind of standard museum bench with a plywood back and cushions added to it. But we all know it's like, what is it? It's like 6 seconds. People stand in front of a painting for 6 seconds or something. And somehow for, oh my God, how long has it been? The 50 years that video has existed in museums. 50 years.
I know.
For the 50 years that that video has existed in museums, like there hasn't been an actual treatment to account for the fact that the work is time-based and that it requires a really different mode of engagement and a different way of moving through institutions. And I think that's something that I'm interested in because I've always been interested in, like my background is film and video, but I've always been interested particularly in the moving image's capacity to index time and to index our own specific real-time experiences with art. And so because of that, it's like really important for me to think about how somebody engages. And it's like the work upstairs is really activated by people in it. I'm just waiting. It's really activated by people in it. And so something that I've noticed that's like really incredible is just to walk into a gallery and like no one's phones are out because there's like, you can't really take a photo of anything in there. And people actually like sit for like a substantial period of time. So for me, like what feels exciting is like using institutional context to change the way or propose other ways of occupying these kinds of spaces.
Yeah, it's always interesting with video, which you and I talk a lot about, and Chrissy Isles and I talk a ton about video, is it feels as if in museums there's this expectation that if you don't watch all of it, you haven't experienced it. And I always find that so startling because what does it mean to like look at a painting and what's the amount of time you should give to it and what's the amount of time you should give to a photograph? And we're so conditioned to look at screens anyways. And so creating a comfortable space is, typically really challenging. And it was something that we talked a lot about within this show was not just comfort, but it was much more about the ambiance of the show, or how do you not like, this exhibition turned creepy very quickly. Like there were some really strong like Stephen King vibes at the start of lighting this show where we were standing next to each other and I couldn't see you. And, it was how do you sort of like shift that? And I think there's something really interesting about the nuances of your practice is not simply, it's not just lighting, it's how do you shift this for how people can in many ways come together and feel comfortable and cared for. And I think that's something that seeing that within the actual process felt really special and beautiful, and just finally get there. Mm-hmm. Every morning we'd wake up and just be like, that's not it, or we thought it was it. Yeah. And then finally it was just like, it was just done. And you were like, very clear. It was intuitive in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and also just like sensitively calibrated,
Yeah.
you know, and it's, you know, more and more I'm just really invested in thinking about exhibition design and like thinking about, yeah, just how these things come together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And your eyesight's way better than mine. Is what we discovered.
I know. It's bizarre.
So you did mention that this is a collaboration with the Walker and Nottingham Contemporary, and I think you started working with Pavel, the curator at the Walker, before I joined. And I remember asking you, you know, you'd been offered to do a commission, and you were thinking about, I don't remember if the work started out originally this way, but I remember thinking, oh wow, like Merce Cunningham's collection is so fantastic, and it's what the Walker is known for. And I'm wondering, you know, how did you begin thinking about dance for camera, thinking about the collaborations that Namjoon Pike did with Merce Cunningham? You've already mentioned Yvonne Rainier, but thinking about some of that legacy,
Yeah.
where did that research sort of begin? And also knowing you are such a filmmaker at the same time, and how did that kind of background come out in this piece, which obviously Long Take is referencing?
Yeah, well, the funny thing, I should give EAI a shout out. You know, before I became, well, I guess I was an artist at this point too, but I used to be an arts administrator, and I worked at a place called EAI, Electronic Arts Intermix, which is a video art archive, and they have done some really incredible conservation work on like historic, you know, works of dance for the camera, and that was probably my first encounter with some of these works. And I mean, it was like, yeah, I think you mentioned Merce Cunningham and Namjoon Pike, but also thinking about, you know, these collaborations where like Merce worked, you know, obviously the dances were scored by John Cage, and, you know, Jasper Johns did the set design, and Rauschenberg did the costumes. It just felt like a really interesting era to think about in terms of people feeling really open about collaboration, and also like not so tightly bound within their own artistic disciplines. But I think the thing that's important for me is like I have this unexplainable obsession with television, and so I think for me what's interesting about this era is that the whole point of people wanting to do dance for the camera, and also, maybe I should cite some other people, well, I'll just say, the whole point of this was really to make dance accessible. And maybe it's not so much the dance part that's really critical, even though it's like at the heart of this work, but it's the interest in media as a tool of accessibility, and thinking about how putting dance on television would democratize the medium, and how somehow there was this dream that television was going to save us, and we would develop a popular culture that kind of accounted for all of these, for a lot of different, you know, modalities of art. And so for me, this work was really about thinking about this kind of hyper-specific historical moment with a consideration for access around television, around public access television, around the democratization of moving image through video, and how we could expand those terms of access to maybe some things that I'm considering today, and that a lot of artists are considering today, and thinking through accessibility as something that maybe has a relationship to television in some like innate and unique way.
Could you maybe name some specific works that you were thinking about? I find most people are often asking me for
references,
direct references, and Chrissy and I were recently talking about Derek Jarman's Blue, which I think is such an influence. I know Derek Jarman is such an influence to you, but absolutely. It feels like such an influence on this work in particular, and it's not a dance for camera work.
No, but I think it's an influence in the sense that, if you're not, we should talk about the work. Yeah, so Blue is this work that this British filmmaker, Derek Jarman, made. I think he finished it a few months before he died of AIDS. I can't remember what year it is.
91, 89?
Somebody knows.
Do you know, Chrissy?
96, okay. Yeah, and it's basically, as his illness progressed, he started to lose some of his sight, and he also had these like kind of like blue ocular things that were happening, and he would kind of see blue. And so he made this work, I think it was commissioned by Channel 4 television, and he made this work, and it's essentially just a blue screen. It's like an Yves Klein blue, and then alongside that is a kind of narration along with some music, essentially. And some of it is a kind of narration of his life, but then some of it has some like other kind of, also kind of Yves Klein specific elements to it. But anyway, yeah, the work is definitely influenced by that work, because this is an artwork that he made in which like the work was conditioned by his own like capacity, basically. Like I think about that work as like its aesthetics are driven by the conditions of the artist's labor and like what the artist's capacity was specifically in his like incapacity as somebody who was like experiencing chronic illness and also at the time terminal illness. So I would say, yeah, like that there is this kind of, I don't really like talking about minimalism so much, but that there's like this thing in which there's a kind of economy of means. There's like an economy of the aesthetic gesture that comes directly from like actual capacity, like it's generated from a kind of material condition of life. So yeah, that's definitely a huge influence. Who else would I would say? Charles Atlas's collaborations with Michael Clark, I think, you know, thinking about Trisha Brown and Babette Mangold working together. And then also some influences that are like outside of dance. Like I've been thinking a lot about just like the relationship between conceptual art and description and how like description has always been like a really critical part of conceptual art. So like two works I was thinking about when I made this work were One in Three Chairs by Joseph Kosuth, which is, if you're not familiar with the work, is essentially a physical chair, a photograph of the chair in the space that it's installed at scale next to the chair, along with a sort of a dictionary description of a chair also affixed to the wall. And so it's thinking about, yeah, these kinds of questions about like how, like what is the work essentially, and how can it exist, and is there how would I say this? What is the relationship between the, you know, the concept of a work and the work itself? So that was maybe a reference, and then maybe the other one would be Performer Audience Mirror, which is a piece by Dan Graham, where he stands in front of a mirror and the audience sits behind him in a room that looks like that is a dance studio, basically. You know, and he is looking into the mirror and sort of narrating and describing the audience behind him and all of their movements and responses in real time. So yeah, I've just been thinking a lot about, yeah, description is this thing that has like a critical relationship to conceptual art and also accessibility, which maybe the argument would be that like accessibility is inherently like a conceptual and aesthetic form.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah.
And maybe it's a large topic to talk about, but
Let's try it.
you know, when you and I were talking the other day, and you've mentioned John Cage already, we have had a couple exhibitions here at the ICA. I'm thinking of Freedom Principle, and I'm also thinking of Anthony Elms's Endless Shout, which brought in Ashon Crowley, and thinking about, you know, the complications, white supremacy of the avant-garde, and the ways in which John Cage, you know, really did not want to consider black musical performance as avant-garde, even though he was appropriating from it at the exact same time. And you said something to me yesterday that I had not thought about, and I have to say I do not have a large performance background. I haven't thought a lot about dance, and working with you has made me think so much more about this. And you sort of mentioned that, you know, avant-garde performance and dance could not be avant-garde without Black vernacular and crip movements, and what that appropriation has meant for the field. And I wondered if you can talk more about that, and then we're going to turn it over into questions.
Yeah, yeah, I guess I would say that, you know, so much of my understanding of modern dance and how modern dance becomes modern is, you know, through the appropriation of like Black vernacular movement and like crip or disabled vernacular movement. And also like how, I mean, this is like a broader conversation philosophically about like Western culture and how the West critiques itself through things outside of it, or through things that are quote unquote outside of itself. And that, I think, is a conversation that obviously holds in the realm of dance, right? So in some ways, this work was also thinking about that. Like, what does it mean to the ways in which, like, Black and Crip movement are simultaneously, like, invisible and hyper-visible at the same time, like, incredibly policed. Maligned, policed. We can think about ugly laws. We can think about so many. I mean, there's so many things that I could talk about around this, but also it's like you're not allowed to appear in public, and then simultaneously you're everywhere, right? And so I think dance is just another place where we can sort of think through some of those problems. And also, I was just, honestly, I have to say, I'm just really inspired by dancers. I want to shout out some people, Gerard, who's here, but also Kayla Hamilton and Alice Shepard, who are incredible dancers, who are also thinking about this, and who are also thinking about, you know, what is the dancer's body? How is the dancer's body figured? And yeah, maybe one other shout out would just be around museum seating, which is Finnegan Shannon is like an incredible artist who's really, I think, kind of changed the way museums relate to seating. Yeah.
Totally. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Always amazing
It's
to be in
always a pleasure.
conversation with you. And maybe since you brought up EAI, I did just want to give a shout out as well to Alex Klein and what's Rebecca's last name? Rebecca Clemens,
yeah.
Have a publication called Broadcasting EAI, and it's 50 years of EAI's history. That's on sale here at the ICA. They co-produced a show back in 2018, if you're interested in video art and EAI. We're going to turn it over to questions, and I think we have a wireless mic. Do we have a wireless mic? Would anyone like to Terrence?
Hi.
Hi, Terrence.
Show was amazing.
Thank you. Same. Ditto.
I thought there was like a musicality that was rendered in how, you know, you talked about that it ended up with instruction, like the last phase was instruction. And I was really delighted by that. It made me, this is my first of two questions, by the way. But that musicality made me wonder what your intentions were when you were writing the score, knowing that that was kind of the initiation point. And my second question related to that is if you could just talk about the absence of music as accompaniment. You know, because you talked about the absence of the ocular, the kind of visual evidence, and how central the rhythm and sound created by Geron's movement was, given the absence of like maybe what we know as music.
I mean, I feel like you just said it. You just like answered it, you know, which is that I have no beefs with music. I do think sometimes it's used in a manipulative way in cinema, but I think it's this complicated thing around access also, which is if there is music, how do you balance music, sound, and description at the same time? Can it work? On a practical level, I have to say from my own experience, it's really hard. But I think in some ways that's also an irrelevant point because of what you're bringing up, which is that the sound of Geron's body is the musicality of the work, right? Is that it brings you into like this space of listening that is like not cognitive. It like feels the way it feels when you listen to music, right? You're just like, oh, I'm having a kind of experience that I can't necessarily put words to. And that's why the center channel of the project is so funny, because it's like an attempt to like turn this like ultimately like really ephemeral sounds, the kinds of things that you don't want to pick up when you're recording, and to sort of name them, to describe them, to attempt to put them to language, and the absurdity of that, right? Like it doesn't really work. It's kind of like an important like failure of the work in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think we're on the same page. I agree. There's like a kind of, it functions as music. It functions as performance and music. Yeah. Thank you.
Chrissy?
Check, check. Okay, forgive my, I had
Right.
too much fun last night. Thank you so much for the work. I'll say that first. And I was really moved by the mix, where you chose to have certain things like more prominent. That corner did me in because it felt like the feet were like right there. It is a dance floor, right? You laid down the dance floor upstairs, right? So I was like, okay, I was in there, I thought alone, and I was gonna dance. I was like, this little spot right here feels like it's calling my name. But I wanted to ask about that intentionality in terms of what's forward. Oftentimes we see performers on a stage and there's the effortlessness, right, of it, of us not being able to hear close up. Right? It makes them like gods, you know? But then being like miking and being so close, it's like an extreme close-up, you know,
Yeah.
visually. And I felt that when I closed my eyes, I was like, wow, I can put it, I guess my question has now turned into a statement. I apologize. Meg saw me crying on the stairs. It was a thing. Because, so that's my first thing. Beautiful mix, and I'd like to know about your process. And then my second question is about what it brought up for me as a filmmaker who loves to hold the camera is my own physical incapabilities at this point in my life, right? And so as I just heard the dance, I knew where I would be in the room. And I mourned a little bit that I would not be able to do it physically. So the fact that you were coming from this place of access and influenced by folks who were dealing with, right, the mortality of the body, now it makes sense. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. I really appreciate your comment. I mean, it's like, I have so many things to say. Well, first I would say is like a lot of my practice is really generated from, I think, what you're describing, which is like being a filmmaker who can't make films in a traditional way because it's exhausting. And like how instead of seeing that as a failure, it like led me to like generate other ways of making and thinking about other ways of making. And like I like to say that my work comes out of thinking about incapacity as having a generative quality to it, basically, and thinking about incapacity as generating something. And usually what incapacity generates is our relations of care, actually. That's what it generates. But yeah, I mean, yeah, the upstairs is structured in such a way so that you're hearing Dron's movement around the outside of the room, and then in the center, you're hearing me and Giselia's kind of like verbal interplay between, the score and the description. And the floor is a piece, it's called Surround Sound, and it's a score-based work, kind of like Joseph Kosuth's 1 and 3 Chairs. And the score or the instruction is basically to cover the gallery floor in Marley dance mats and to not clean the floor. So the museum's been instructed to not clean the floor, which means that over the course of the duration, the floor will pick up the marks of spectators as they move through the space. So in some ways, your desire to dance, I hope, will be indexed in the exhibition for the duration of the show. That's like the hope and the desire. And I don't know if that answered everything, but that's what I wanted to say. Yeah.
Hi, congratulations to both of you. Congratulations on the show. It's just a fantastic show. Carolyn, congratulations,
Thank you.
Meg. It was really wonderful. As you were talking, I was thinking about Maya Deren's film, Choreography for the Camera,
Yeah.
1945, and her films of the 40s and 50s that really set the stage for kind of dance films and then videos in the 60s and then the 70s. And I was thinking about Maya Deren's work with Kathleen Dunham as her assistant in the 40s, and how that kind of black influence from from Dunham through Darren to Yvonne Rainer, and that sort of, like you said with Cage, Meg, that sort of unspoken and unrecognized absolute sort of underpinning somehow. So that was just not a question so much of a thought, but maybe leading to a question or another thought in relation to choreography for the camera and your show and the different pieces, because Maya Deren takes the camera and collaborates with the dancer to make the film, to choreograph the movement. And it seems like, with the different works in your show, you've sort of replaced the camera with, because you're choreographing us through the space. You've almost kind of made a film that will only be seen at the end. It's almost like you're editing a film
in real
or making
time.
it now in real time, and we are also collaborating with the dancer, because there's the movements that are already made, and then there's not just our kind of wandering through the space, but you are the dancer, and you are choreographing us through the space, because once you start to follow the speakers and then start to move around them and then move across them and resist the frontality of the text, and also a call to the seating that's very deliberately placed in different parts of the space, the longer you spend with it and then you stare down at the floor because you're looking for the image, there's a certain moment when you're in the space and you go, oh, there isn't an image. Like, we are collectively the image. Everything in the space is the image, but it's unfolding over time. And so it really makes me want to come back at the end of the show and just feel the affect of that collaborative trace and how that's going to work with the sound, with what's the works that have been there from the beginning.
That was just really beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the thing about Maya Deren, I'm going to start in the beginning and then keep going. The thing about Maya Deren is interesting because I didn't think about her as an influence, but now that you bring it up, it's like, yeah, obviously. It's funny, I think when I first saw Maya Deren's dance films, like in undergrad or something, I was constantly being told, like, this is a good representation of Black people. And so I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess this is a good representation of Black people. And obviously, like, everything we know about Deren, her investments, her interests, I don't know. I guess I think this would be a good time to complicate that or to rethink that or try to understand what her investments actually were and what those collaborations actually felt like to the people involved in them. But yeah, in terms of the space, like, yeah, I mean, it's like, surprise, you're part of the work, that is the goal. That's the hope. And I like thinking about it as a kind of ongoing editing process. This is a thing that is in ongoing construction. And in some ways it has no end, actually. Yeah.
Well, there's something interesting about, I often think about, with works, I was working on Terrence's book and getting all the credits of everyone that's worked on the pieces. And I feel like cinema is often the place that is most citational of everyone's labor. And oftentimes the art world really fails in that capacity unless an artist is really, really pushing for that. And so there's something interesting here where the work is seemingly, you come to it and it feels as if it's done, but actually all of the collective participation and mark making and thoughts and desires, Ronnie, within that space then make the film, and the traces are there, and it feels as if that's even more part of a cinematic type of approach. And I know because Chrissy and I have been spending more time with each other than anyone else at all right now, that you're thinking so much of how you can have an expansive moving image collection at the Whitney, and what does it mean to collect moving image, and that it's not simply just film and video, and the things that you're bringing in have those types of collective mark making and traces that I find really exciting that your work is in a lot of engagement with.
Yeah, and just to add to that we can also think about cinema, like we can think like para-cinematically, like it doesn't have to be just like a projection on a wall with sound, that cinema is like kind of a mode of relating, and that can happen in a lot of different ways, and we can like sort of break up what our understandings of that medium are.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thank you. Hello, hello. Hi, Carol.
The man
Hi,
of the
Meg.
hour.
Just want to say the dancer was fabulous. I am so grateful to you for this work on an assortment of level, on in a number of ways. One of the things I've been thinking about throughout is this idea of like division of labor, both in the context of the piece itself, to wherein you enabled a single body to be multiple, and then for this work and for your other works to be experienced in multiplicity across three museums and galleries. So I wanted to ask, like, could you take us through, or what has that been energetically to, and what does that mean, kind of, in the art context, in the production art context, in your own personal context, to like expand your actual body across multiple spaces and contexts at the same time? And what does that mean for Black bodies? What does that mean for Black disabled bodies, and the concept of labor to you?
You mean also like about the work, but also about me?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Well, I think the one thing that's cool about the work, like it's installed simultaneously now at Nottingham, and that's something that like rarely happens in museums. Like you won't really have like the same show in two places, because we have to like somehow honor the sanctity of artwork as like singular, and I don't know. And so I think it was a coincidence, but I was really happy about that. Like I wanted to feel what it felt like to have the same artwork showing in two places, because a lot of the times I think video and sound-based work that are endlessly reproducible are kind of artificially treated like they're not in art. And that in some ways it's kind of like, why? Like, why would I just be like, oh, it's just one work and it's here, when I could literally email everybody in this room like the files for the video, and you could watch it under whatever conditions you wanted to. So I think for me that's something that feels like important, and that also has a relationship with access, right? Which is that we want people to experience this work in a lot of different ways in the gallery, but also that it will live on in certain modes of description online, et cetera, et cetera. So that's important. And then in terms of labor, I'm trying to think about division of labor. Do you want to talk about collaboration? Yeah. I don't know how to say this. I like need other people, and I need other people like in my life as just like a person who like loves and wants and needs things, and also as an artist. And that I have personally found it very challenging to be individuated as an artist, because it feels untrue. And so I really appreciate these opportunities to get to work with you and other friends and people who trust me with their own work. Duran is my favorite dancer, like it's I don't know, it's just such a blessing to get to do that. It means so much to me, and it helps, how do I say this? It helps soften the blow of individuation in this world, to remember that we can do things together, and that we're always doing things together, even if they're not acknowledged as such, and that we can hold that together and acknowledge each other in that process. So, labor is complicated, collaboration is complicated, but I'd prefer it to anything else.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much to both of you. And yeah, the show is really, really special. For first I just want to comment on something, and then I'll ask a clarifying question to something you just said. Unformed, in-process comment that just experiencing everything you both just offered is making me feel really free in my mind. Everything you offered about just unbounding the work and unbounding, but also not externally projecting from the body. And I feel the ways in which your work, this piece and other pieces, really invites me to be in my body, and from that place, really feeling that space of fugitivity and that place of like going elsewhere, but being embodied and going elsewhere together. I'm like, oh, where are we going? So I've just been feeling that as I'm sitting here, and it's really a very new somatic experience within our institutions for me. So just wanted to offer and reflect that.
Thank you.
And say thank you. And then I really loved what you just shared about expanding our notion of the cinematic as a modality of relating to one another and the world. And I'm just wondering if you can expand on that a little bit, because I think I know what you mean, but I'm not totally sure.
I'm also not sure what I mean.
Okay. I love the way it sounds, though.
It sounded cool. I just mean that there are certain materials that we associate with cinema: projection, light, sound, a surface. Those things can be a lot of different things. What is the surface? What is the sound? What is projection? What is light? Like how, I don't know, there's just like so much there. And I think that so much of it, like I'm interested in thinking about all of the structures that allow us to experience cinema. So like cinema is also like sitting in a room with a bunch of people facing in one direction. Like there's just a lot there that can be sort of like disentangled and like deconstructed and put back together. And then, yeah, I guess, maybe I'm faltering a little bit, but I'm just really interested in like the material of like the moving image. Like I'm really interested in its materiality. I'm interested in like what it does. I'm interested in like, it not only exclusively as a site of projection, but as something that has all of these conditions around it that are really material. Like it's literally like, or not anymore, but it literally was just like, it has a physicality to it. Its physicality is like almost lost now, but we also like it's like still a critical reference for like what we understand as cinema, if that makes sense. I don't know if I'm answering your question well. I feel like there's something else I want to say, but it's like not coming to me. Do you have a thought?
Nope.
Okay.
I was really trying to come up with something, but I don't got it.
No, okay. I'll say one last thing, and then we can wrap up, which is just basically that, like, it can be a physiological experience, right? Like, we can sit and we can just have this totally ocular experience where our body disappears and we're just, like, having a cognitive thing going on through the eyes. We're receiving it. That's the experience. It's done. But it also has this capacity to be physiological. There are ways of using the media that actually contend with what it means to like relate to cinema and to perceive it. Like, not just is it comfortable, but like, there are movies that are like 8 hours long. There are movies that like trigger hallucinogenic and psychedelic visions. There are, there's just like so many different ways that it can operate outside of this like really specific cognitive thing, which I also love, but I want a really expanded definition of what like cinema can be and what it can do.
Well, maybe one of the questions I just have is, maybe you're thinking about the ways in which cinema has become limited in its definition because of the film industry and how it has to market cinema.
Yeah.
And that it can be so much more than that.
Yeah, and also that like everybody can make it.
I think that's an iPhone commercial.
Yeah. Somebody hire me.
I think that is. No, I'm not kidding.
Is it really?
I think it's an iPhone commercial. It's like everyone's a filmmaker.
I mean, that's kind of like, I don't know. Yeah.
Sorry,
I mean,
that was depressing.
No,
way to
no.
end, but-
I don't know. I'm just gonna stick beside it. It's true.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Thank you.